Every week, a lot happens in Parliament. Debates rage, bills are discussed, and laws are introduced. So it's easy to feel like you don't quite know what's going on in the chamber. So we're lifting the lid and telling you exactly what happened this week in Parliament. This week, we saw Matt Hancock in front of the Science and Technology Committee, a House of Lords report criticising the government's actions on the coronavirus, and a foreign aid amendment that nearly became the government's first full-scale rebellion. In our first story this week, we return back to the joint meeting of the Science and Technology Committee and the Health and Social Care Committee. After a marathon hearing with the Prime Minister's former Chief Advisor Dominic Cummings, this week saw the turn of Secretary of State for Health and Social Care Matt Hancock. Following the explosive allegations put forward by Cummings, all eyes were on Hancock and how he would respond. The committee went through various allegations made by Cummings.
So I'm going to begin with some questions drawing on those accusations that have been made. And I want to stress that these are suggestions, allegations that Dominic Cummings has made. They're not the committee's charges. So the first is, did you say that everyone who needed treatment got the treatment that they required when you'd been told by the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer that people did not get the treatment that they deserved?
I did absolutely say, both in private and in public, that everybody got the COVID treatment that they needed. And I'm very proud of the fact that with the NHS, we delivered on that during the pandemic because it was critical.
On PPE, in April, did you ever say or brief the shortages, such as they were the fault of Simon Stevens, the fault of the Chancellor of the Exchequer? It's not my fault. They blocked approvals. That's what Mr. Cummings told the committee.
No, that is not a fair recollection of the situation.
And the third charge was around testing in care homes. So specifically, did you tell the Prime Minister in March that people in hospitals would be tested before they went back into care homes?
We set out a policy that people would be tested when tests were available. And then I set about building the testing capacity to be able to deliver on that.
Then Hancock was given the opportunity to reply more broadly to the allegations.
Well, it is telling that no evidence has been provided yet. But there's a reason for that, I think, which is that, throughout this, I have got out of bed every morning with the view and the attitude that my job is to do everything I could to protect lives and to get this country out of the pandemic. And I've approached that with a mission-driven determination to make it happen.
The committee tried to drill down into why Cummings seemed to have a vendetta against Hancock, as well as the wider role that Cummings held within the government.
Why do you think it was that Dominic Cummings chose to be quite so withering? Did you have a bad personal engagement over the times? Was it a sincere difference of policy view?
I have no idea. I worked directly with the Prime Minister from the start of this. And, of course, I worked with his aides and his team as well. And I have no idea.
Did you know that he wanted the Prime Minister to fire you?
Yes, because he briefed the newspapers at the time. Or somebody briefed the newspapers. I now have a better idea of who it was.
And did you raise an objection to that?
Yes, of course, and I had the Prime Minister's wholesome support all the way through.
And was that problematic in your discharge of your duties in Whitehall, that this was happening in the newspapers, in the public prints, but also reflecting discussions that were taking place in Downing Street?
Well, I think the best thing to say about this, and this will be corroborated by lots of people in government, the best thing to say is that government has operated better over the past 6 months.
The committee then questioned whether Hancock and Johnson had provided a scapegoat through relying on scientists.
I do want to give you a chance to comment on the record. He said that you used the whole "we are following the science" line as a way that meant that you could always say, well, if things go wrong, we'll blame the scientists and it's not my fault. And he said he saw you discuss that with the Prime Minister. Is that true?
I don't think so, no. And I'll tell you why. And we discussed it at the Select Committee before. My approach throughout has been that we are guided by the science. I try not to say that we follow the science. There are examples where ministers make decisions different to the scientific advice. One example is that when we brought back people from Wuhan in January, I was advised that they should be asked to go home and isolate. And I said, no, they need to quarantine. Now, that is an example of the scientific advice saying you can be more relaxed about things and me being tougher. Now, when it comes to the decisions around lockdown, we did accept and implement the scientific advice.
In any case, the lack of written evidence to substantiate Cummings' allegations seems to have given Hancock a relatively easy pass, for now at least. In the second story this week, we take a look at a report published by the Constitution Committee of the House of Lords. A few weeks ago, we discussed a report by this committee looking into the impact of fixed penalty notices on coronavirus rule breakers. In a report published Thursday, the House of Lords looked at another perceived failure of the government: the lack of parliamentary scrutiny over government coronavirus legislation. The committee claims that as a parliamentary democracy, Parliament holds the government to account, and as such, better laws are made, allowing for a wide range of representatives to be involved in the lawmaking process. They claim that this increases the legitimacy of all such laws. This, though, is simply how they claim things should work. The committee claims that instead, the government has tended to use secondary legislation. This type of legislation allows ministers to make changes to the law through pre-existing provisions. And this is what the government has done in many cases to impose coronavirus restrictions, therefore bypassing Parliament. In fact, the committee specifically looked at the original decision by the government to impose lockdowns. In order to do this, they used secondary legislation and the 1984 Public Health Act to impose said lockdown. The committee has offered two alternatives that they claim the government should have used to ensure that parliamentary scrutiny was not lost. The first is the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, which has many provisions about how long emergency legislation can remain before being approved by both houses. And the second was including a lockdown provision in the Coronavirus Act of 2020, with specific provisions for parliamentary scrutiny. Either of these options would have provided the necessary emergency powers while retaining parliamentary scrutiny, something the Lords directly criticised Number 10 for not doing enough of. What do you think, though? Would that parliamentary scrutiny have resulted in better coronavirus legislation? Or would this just have slowed down the government when they were making decisions that ultimately saved lives? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. In the final story this week, we return to the Commons and to an amendment put forward by the former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell to the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency Bill. The amendment sought to reaffirm the UK's international aid commitment at 0.7% of GNI, restoring the UK's target to the previous level before the government announced a cut to just 0.5%. Initial indications were that the amendment would have garnered enough support in the House, with over 30 Conservative MPs publicly pledging to vote in support of the amendment, including former Prime Minister Theresa May. The issue being that, as is the case with all amendments in the Commons, it would have had to be selected by the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. And while Mitchell said he received clear advice from clerks that the amendment would be within the scope of the bill, the Speaker had other ideas.
Before we move to statements, I want to say something about the selection of amendments and new clauses for the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency Bill. I told the House in my statement on the 29th of January 2020 that as Speaker of the House I am committed to transparency and I respect and trust the advice from clerks in this House. As the House will know, and as Erskine May states, the Chair is not expected to give reasons for the decision on the selection of amendments. However, on an exceptional basis, I want to say something about why new Clause 4 has not been selected. I'm doing so on this occasion because of the high level of interest in the new clause in the House and outside it. Amendments and new clauses which are not within the scope of the bill are out of order. Erskine May states, The scope of the bill represents reasonable limits of its collective purposes as defined by its existing clauses and schedules. In this instance, having taken advice from the House's senior clerks and the Officer of Speaker's Counsel, I have deemed that new Clause 4 to be outside the scope of the bill. New Clause 4 is therefore not selected and may not be debated today.
In response, the PM spokesman said that the cut in foreign aid was sanctioned under current legislation, leading some to look at the possibility of potential legal action in order to force a vote on the matter. With the Speaker blocking the amendment, the potential rebellion faded, but there still seems to be a majority of MPs who want to see international aid rise once again. So if the government persists at the 0.5% level, they may find themselves in trouble in the near future. If you want to be updated with what happens in Parliament next week, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.